Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nicole Welk-Joerger. Nicole Welk-Joerger is an interdisciplinary historian trained in art history, anthropology, and the history of science, technology, and medicine. She's currently a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University's High Meadow Environmental Institute. There, she is leading the environmental studies program. She is she is leading. She is the leader, and she also is leading it. The Environmental Studies Program Senior Colloquium, and working on her first book project, tentatively titled Rumination, A Story of Sustainability in the United States. She bridges these disciplines to tell stories about how capitalism has shaped understandings of non-human life, including what constitutes healthy and sustainable relationships in agriculture. She's also working on a project titled Farm Farms. That's a PH farm, and then an F farm, which I just love. Farm Farms, Agriculture and Animals in Human Medicine, which analyzes the intersection of industrial agriculture and human medicine through early 20th century pharmaceutical farms. And then finally, her third project is titled Electrified Bodies, A Brief History of Stray Voltage, in which she's exploring how humans attempt to make sense of how non-humans experience electrified landscapes differently. So ad hoc, I am just awarding her the medal for best project titles, because I had so much fun reading about her various projects, various projects, and the way she conceives of them and how she titles them, because those were so fun. So please join me today in welcoming Nicole Welk-Joerger.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Andrea. And I see Caroline and Corey in the audience here. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this group in this conversation. As you can tell from the intro, my work with the Amish community is it's quite on the fringe and the framework on the edges of a lot of the work that I'm doing now. And what I'm presenting today is actually based on ethnographic work that I did quite a few years ago. So it's been almost 7 years since I've reapproached this ethnographic work. And although I continue to check up on and touch base with some of the farmers that I talk about in this presentation and in the article that I'm working on right now, the actual findings are from quite a few years ago. So just to as a warning, as I'm going through and talking about this work today, which I'm very happy to talk about again, as well as have a conversation about with all of you today. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and get started here with the presentation, which I'm going to read. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I also have, as you can tell, there's the transcript on the bottom here for the audio. So I don't know if I added that or if Andrea, if you posted that, but that's helpful for anyone who, I think it's part of my PowerPoint presentation. You can, I like to have a transcript for accessibility purposes if anyone is hard of hearing. Okay, so without further ado, remarking in part on John A. Hostetler's belief that the Amish would cease to exist if they moved away from farming, McConnell and Lovelace asked the following in their book, Nature and the Environment in Amish Life in 2018. Quote, given that the percentage of full-time farmers has fallen to under 20% in all the large Amish settlements, does it make sense to continue to hold up the Amish as purveyors of agrarian wisdom, unquote. This provocation helped launch McConnell and Lovelace into an exploration of the false binary and non-Amish understandings, aka English understandings, of Amish life and nature. Given praises about Amish life by famous writers like Wendell Berry and heavy-handed critiques voiced by leaders of organizations like the Environmental Protection Agency, the authors explored if, quote, the Amish are ecological saints or environmental sinners, unquote. In their book, McConnell and Lovelace successfully obliterated this boundary and illustrated the nuances and complexities in the way that the Amish think about themselves as part of nature. But having worked with Amish farmers and the companies that sell their products and the products and information to them in the past, This earlier question regarding quote-unquote agrarian wisdom has remained a sticking point for me, especially paired with the fact that fewer Amish are taking on full-time farming operations in a world that sees them as inherently agrarian. This is because the English are not the only ones that align Amish life with agrarian values. From within their communities, I witnessed Amish farmers express feeling pressures that were a little different from those of their non-farming Amish siblings, friends, and neighbors. Some of these pressures were related to disagreements about technological adoption and use on the farm. Other pressures stem directly from the unique economic uncertainties that come with farming operations. These tensions, large and small, illustrated the sustained importance of farming for the Amish community on both an individual and a societal level. With fewer in this occupation and way of life, I argue that Amish farmers are feeling the burden of upholding an agrarianism that defines Amish life within their own communities. So for the remainder of this presentation, I want to explore this question using a series of case studies I have documented in my ethnographic research conducted particularly between 2013 and 2015. As I have published elsewhere, the foundation of my research during these years was unique in that I worked through an agribusiness liaison to gain access to primarily Old Order Amish farming families located in South Central Pennsylvania and Northern Maryland. Over the course of my research, I visited over 80 different Amish dairy farms that relied on supplemental cattle feed sold by the company I worked with during this time. The case studies I will outline in the last half of this presentation come from these visits where feed company specialists met with Amish customers weekly and discussed at great length what was or was not working on a given operation. And I talk about this in a little bit more detail in my Amish Anthropocene piece that I know that was linked for this meeting today. So you might even recognize this picture from that particular article that I published a few years ago. So before going into these case studies, which I'll give 2 today, there's 4 in the actual larger article, I want to briefly discuss what I mean by Amish agrarianism, how I see agrarian values operating differently in the Amish community and separate from the ways that agriculturalists in the United States more generally may value nature or the environment. So agrarian ideals arguably anchored early colonial settlement and later 18th century political foundations of what we now call the United States, processes that are very much part of Amish history and have since informed Amish ways of interacting with the natural world. Now, since this time, philosophers, scientists, and politicians through the 19th, 20th, and into the 21st centuries have argued for and against various developing elements of agrarianism, which have led to multiple definitions and specific characteristics that frame it. And if anyone's interested in learning more about agrarianism and how it's defined in various different ways, I recommend looking into writings like these. Pertaining to Amish ways of living, it is the early American agrarian ideals that reinforce the basic tenets of the Ordnung. For centuries, one of the most successful ways to act on worldly separation has been focusing on living off the land. Creating self-sustaining farming operations was possible for some time, but as historians of the Amish have noted, to economically sustain their communities, the Amish have long participated in the general US agricultural economy. Technological developments of the 19th and 20th centuries actually allowed Amish to create further Ordnung distinctions between worldly and Amish life. And interestingly, these developments also created factions and ideologies of general agrarianism. So for instance, in the early 20th century, Liberty Hyde Bailey was hesitant about various agricultural technological developments from tractors to chemical agriculture, and the agrarian faction formed around these concerns, and they thus echo the tenets of technological restraint, critique, and evaluation that continue to exist with the Amish Ordnung today, likely contributing to contemporary praise of Amish farming in agrarian culture. So to reiterate, the 2 important elements of agrarianism I see operating in Amish communities are the following. First, economic independence through living off the land. an independence that enables worldly separation, and 2, restraint of technological adoption based on earlier developments in the history of agriculture, which allowed for further worldly Amish distinctions. These are ideal elements, not necessarily the reality as it's working on the ground, but I argue they inform some of the tensions that I noticed for particularly old order Amish farmers in Pennsylvania and Maryland when I was conducting research in the 2010s. So dairy farming occupies a really unique space for exploring such agrarian tensions, as for many years, dairy farming had allowed Amish farmers to fulfill economic independence given its year-long milk markets. However, dairying has become much more difficult to sustain over the years, especially on the smaller operations that dominate the Amish model, in part because these internal debates regarding technology use, and in part because of these debates of technology use and the possible expansion of these operations. So more expansion, more money sort of thing here. These complications started in the mid-20th century with grade A fluid milk regulations requiring new technological adoptions like the bulk refrigerated milk tank and the milking machines. And despite these necessary state mandated technological adoptions, dairying continues to occupy a special place in what could be called an occupational hierarchy of Amish life. And I'm still kind of thinking through this a bit and trying to make sense of it through this older ethnographic fieldwork and through touching base with some of my informants that I had years earlier. So dairy farming pursued at times with great fervor by its members, despite its many challenges. Speaking with an English banker, for instance, whose clientele in 2013 comprised mostly of Amish businessmen, Amish farmers pursued dairying for reasons related to community and family building. Quote, almost all of them will tell you they want to dairy because it's close to home. Dad can be with the family and the children get older, it gives them something to do. They have work, they're not just idle at home, unquote. So later in that same interview, he noted, quote, it's important to remember that they're working for a way of life, unquote. The banker set dairying apart from other occupations that we discussed during his interview, which included greenhouses, construction, and produce, just to name a few. When listing these other businesses, he was careful to note that in many cases, these operations helped finance the dairying business, with him even saying to himself, quote, I sometimes ask myself, why are they milking cows, unquote. The integrity of the dairying operation was wrapped up in these familial values that defined Amish life. And it was something that needed to be sustained even supplementally, if need be, when talking to these economic advisors. So these observations match those of long-standing studies about Amish life, including Craybill and Nolt's notes about how the Amish see agriculture as, quote, religious tenet and Christian duty, unquote, and, quote, the seedbed of family life, unquote. As these and other scholars have described, these tenets become prey to reinterpretation and bargaining given late 20th century external pressures that have included land scarcity, land prices, urbanization, and tourism. So I argue that the farms that survived would go on to be held at a different Ordnung standard than when compared to other types of Amish businesses. Technology use best illustrates this elevated standard and expectation for Amish agriculturalists to, quote unquote, perform agrarian within their communities. As mentioned earlier, from state mandated adoption, it has been necessary for Amish participation in the fluid milk market, but these technologies are linked directly to the harvest and storage of milk from cows. Rearing and caring for cattle are arguably the most important tenets of dairying, but they are often out of the purview of the state. The majority of my ethnographic encounters with Amish dairy farmers have been set in the space of care. And as a result, I witnessed a diverse range of technological mediations regarding animal care. It was in these instances that I noticed that there were different expectations for farmers and what it meant to quote unquote look or quote unquote perform agrarian or agrarianism within the community. So this is where I'm going to end the presentation, these last 5 to 10 minutes here, with 2 examples. So, and they're ethnographic, so bear with me with the narrative. First example, over the month of May 2013, Pete updated the other feed salesman on the dairy team on one of his customers' technological challenges with the church. Eli B, as was a younger Amish man with a growing herd of cattle. To assist him in mixing his feed without using a TMR mixer, Eli installed a forage wagon outside of his silo, very much kind of like this. The feed would be poured into the forage wagon, which was installed with a small elevator that would lift the feed up and into Eli's cart. This clever system mixed Eli's rations in a way that encouraged his animals to consume their needed starches, fibers, and proteins with the most favorable smelling feeds. Amish farmers who are not able to have a TMR, total mixed ration mixer, usually pour these supplemental rations on top of one another instead of mixing them into their silage or hay. The disadvantage of this method is the animal can avoid these supplements if she does not find them as favorable as the fermented feed, which is usually piled underneath. So cattle will just push these vitamins over, and it can cause various different health problems or drops in production if they're not eating the full ration, all of the vitamins in the supplement. So to the average person, Eli's system was a clever technological loophole he found without installing an electrical TMR mixer. But within the community, Eli began to upset other farmers. In the first week of the month, Pete had announced that Eli, quote unquote, might lose his wagon. Pete had passed by the farm that day to see that the wagon was in the field and not in the vicinity of the silo. At the time, I was riding with Gene, a different feed salesman, who had explained to me that he sometimes would be asked for advice from farmers about technological advances or loopholes. And Gene had given Eli the advice a few weeks earlier to keep his forage wagon, even after the bishop had approached him about some of the members of the community finding the system, quote unquote, unfavorable. To hear the wagon was moved to the field shocked Gene and actually caused like a little bit of guilt during this interaction, since Eli seemed really keen to keep his wagon. Forces stronger than his ambition must have sparked the move, and this concerned the entire office this morning. They thought that they had given some poor advice, or they had caused a disruption, and they didn't want to do this. So the next week, Pete updated us once again on Eli's status. The forage wagon would be left up to a vote. One of the ministers initially brought the forage wagon, quote unquote, problem to the settlement's bishop. But the bishop was so torn by the subject, he decided it best for the church to vote on if Eli could keep his wagon. By the next week, the voting had been completed, and the church decided that Eli's wagon was acceptable. The only minister to vote against Eli was a farmer minister who brought the subject to the bishop in the first place. The salesman made it a point to explain to me that this farmer was not doing as well as Eli financially, and it could very well have been the jealousy and animosity between these two individuals that caused him to bring the entire situation up to the bishop in the first place. So there's a lot of interpersonal issues also going on here, possibly. To appease the displeased farmer who lost the vote, Eli built a shed over his forage wagon, so it was no longer in the line of sight of passerby. He'd explained to me later that this was not a problem for Eli, who made his wagon more efficient in the shed. But this particular point is something important to highlight, as it speaks to what David Walbert has described as the importance of, quote unquote, looking like a traditional farmer in the Amish community, even if the reality is much more complicated. So despite possible jealousy, the major issue with Eli's forage wagon was it could have been seen publicly by neighbors, members, and even non-Amish passerby. So the church dubbed the tool important for cattle rearing, but frivolous within the confines of Amish agrarian ideals. Second example, so this is an idea of like a public technology or public facing technological adoption and some of the disruptions and tensions that I noticed here. And then this is an example of a private situation. So, and I'll reiterate this in my writing, apologies. The case of the public forage wagon contrasts sharply with the notion of quote unquote looking or quote unquote performing agrarian ideals in private, which anchored several interactions I had with a farmer that I will call Jonas. During my first interaction with him, Jean and I found Jonas working in the barn, sitting in the seat of his tow motor, adorned with a bucket and cage fork. There's a tow motor. He pushed the manure that was found piled on the ground into the bucket to lift it up into the manure spreader he found outside, that could be found outside the entrance of the back barn area. When Jonas saw us, he leaped, and I mean leaped. He leapt nervously out of the tow motor and cautiously walked toward Jean, who had a menacing grin on his face. Jonas forced out a small laugh, and as he approached the fence that separated the back barn from the milking area, he shook his head and said, quote, I'm not sure you came at the best time, unquote, referring to the unconventional way of collecting manure. Jean laughed, saying, quote, it's okay, Jonas, I see your fork laying up there next to the post, unquote. Later, Jean would regret not being quick enough to joke around with Jonas further. He thought it would have been amusing to see the reaction that he had if he had told Jonas that his bishop was riding down the lane to visit him at that moment. So the joke of the performance of farm work that I witnessed here with limited technology enforced conversations and subsequent visits to Jonas's farm. During the following week's consultation with Jonas, and in this case, this farmer, we met with them every week. Some farmers, we only met with them every other week, but met with him the very following week. Consultation with Jonas, for example, Jean and I met with him as he was in the middle of scooping out his feed rations by hand, all the while pushing his 3-chambered feed cart with his younger son, Lloyd, riding in the empty side van of the wooden bin. Jonas grinned in remembrance of our last meeting, quote, well, you came at the right time this time, or you came at the right moment this time, unquote, were his first words to us. His self-acknowledgement of the technological downgrade produced a little more tension than joking in his voice, as if he was reminded to be on guard of the possibility that his bishop or anyone else in his social circle was witnessing him at work. The truth was that the ever-looming concern was that was what made the banter between Jean and Jonas funny, but it also revealed the stress of performing agrarian, even in a private and hidden setting. So this was the case of Jean and Jonas, and this is the case of Pete and Eli. So for way of quick conclusion, these are just 2 examples of how agrarian ideals have been negotiated or expressed on Old Order Amish farms in Pennsylvania and Maryland that I've encountered. In the larger article, I also consider how the role of trustees in ensuring the survival of Amish dairy farms and the reliance of Amish farmers on agribusinesses, like the one I worked with, for agricultural knowledge, because all of these examples illustrate a strange time for looking, performing, and sustaining Amish agrarianism into the 21st century. Yes, it's true that the Amish have continued to flourish in the wake of fewer full-time farming operations, but those that have survived hold a special place in the technological negotiations, economic investment, and social hierarchy of Amish communities today. And I would argue that just as agrarian ideals prove polarized among non-Amish communities, so too do Amish value a specific agrarianism that gets negotiated with and expressed by their fellow farming members differently. So with that, I'll stop share, and that's the conclusion of my short presentation here, and I'm very happy to hear feedback and any questions that you might have. So thanks again for having me.